In today's video, we're going to be continuing to build all of the Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach Ruin DLC in Minecraft. Last time we built all of Chapter 2 with the daycare and the Fazbear Theater along with their AR form, but now we're going to be moving on to Monty Golf. This area has its gameplay split in between two different chapters, with us entering and walking around the main floor in Chapter 1, and then returning to the catwalks in Chapter 3 just after escaping the daycare. And we're going to be building all of it, from the small story ride showing off the origins of Monty joining the band, all the way to the gondola workshop just before we finish the chapter. And just like I always do, the first step in any big build like this is outlining. This is the part of the project where I spend multiple days with Security Breach opened on a second monitor as I fly around the in-game location to measure how this should be replicated in Minecraft. This ended up being the most complicated build to outline so far, as most of the ruins are compacted together in a way that makes it hard to make things out, so it took a lot of time to make sure everything was in its proper place. But with all preparations now set and without any more further ado, let's get started with a time-lapse and build the first part of Monty Golf. For this time-lapse, I want to start by going over the building experience that I've had so far with this project, as during my first playthrough of Ruin, it hit me pretty quickly that this game was completely different from what I'd been used to with Security Breach. But when I first got started on the Ruin Pizzaplex, I was still in the same mindset as when I built my first one last year, assuming that things would be pretty similar when it came to how I'd go about building it. And to put it simply, I couldn't have been more wrong about it. Last year I started every new area the same way. I'd first look around to see what blocks I would need to use for building, as well as finding any limitations that could cause a problem and try to work around them. Now, while most of that is still the same this time, what I didn't expect was how much more extra planning there would need to be. Outlining a build was something I used to be able to do within a couple of days, but now I found myself needing more time to work on this project just because of the amount of detail that's been added for this build. I've mentioned this before, but my normal style of Minecraft building are symmetrical and well kept, so I wanted to make sure that I knew how much space I'd need for all of these ruined details in this build, since it's something I'm not completely used to. In fact, this area was something I was honestly a little nervous getting into, as most of the details in this build are stacked on top of each other, and it could have been very easy for me to lose track of where I'm at and what goes where. It's not just the same simple trash pile here and large scaffolding there, but every area so far has different types of rubble to it, since every attraction has a different theme. In the lobby there are a few cave-ins that don't appear anywhere else, but in the daycare there were the play areas where the play structures had fallen down, and now here in Monty Golf there's a lot of natural and organic builds since the place is themed after a swamp. It's not helped by the fact that almost everything here is a shade of green, which causes a lot of the build to blend together. Now this can also work in my favor, since most of these things are supposed to look messy, but I still need to be able to know what prop is going where while still adding everything needed. This is why I prefer over detailing my outline, so that way when I start building, I have a lot more confidence since I've already marked down everything and know what to expect. Another thing that really helps out while building is splitting the room into sections to work in a set order. Since almost every room in the Pizzaplex tends to be quite big, looking at it as a whole can make it really difficult to know where to start. For this build, for example, I used the entrance and the balcony as my starting spot, and then from there I started to work around the outsides of the room and slowly make my way back to circle to finish it off. An easy way to figure this out is by following the path that people would normally walk through to travel around the attraction. From there, one place leads to another, and as I continue, you'll notice how much more progress is being made since I'm focusing on one part at a time. With that aside, however, Monty Golf has ended up being one of my favorite parts to build so far. It might sound unsurprising since this is the most recent build I've made, but the atmosphere and the environment really stood out from everything else, as the natural and organic builds are a big contrast compared to the rest of the Pizzaplex. This lets me work with different types of block palettes than what I've been used to, as now I'm working with lots of green and vegetation. The smaller trees, for example, are made up of fences and terracotta, but then the larger ones use actual wood blocks as well as proper leaves to keep the transparent look to them. During all this, I still need to make sure that the build looks run down. As I mentioned in part 1 of this series, even if a build is made the right way, it still needs to look like how it's supposed to and fit the environment it's in. This is why you'll see me using a few different types of blocks to add more detail to some surfaces, as the Pizzaplex no longer looks clean and polished in Ruin. The main technique I've used for this is mixing multiple dark colors together and then adding spots of concrete powder around it to make it seem like the color is wearing away. I've also carried this over to the floors and carpet as well, as not only does it help break up the solid colors, but concrete powder also has a rough look to it, which adds another level of extra detail to it. I found that this is very important to do, especially for larger builds like this, as it can be very easy to fill in a large area with just a single block and make the build uninteresting to look at. This is something I also consider consider when I make the ceiling for Monty Golf, which is something I get to later, where I use a mix of different types of stone and grey blocks to look like the pipes that go across it. Something else I've had to get used to is learning not just to build in straight directions, but to add angles, as a lot of details here are rotated to the side. This is when Minecraft can be a little tricky to work in, since everything is made out of blocks stuck facing in a certain direction, so angling builds requires a lot more imagination and creativity to get right. The giant Monty head and the fallen down attraction banner show this off really well, as they're both angled builds that aren't just made up of flat surfaces. Now this isn't something I could just do on my first try, so what I ended up doing was designing both of them in a test world before I even started working on this build. That way I could get them to look good while still making sure they could fit in their place. And not only does this give me practice on working on angles, but the Monty head is also an organic shape, which is something I'm still learning to get better at. And I think it turned out quite well, so it is quite a shame we're never going to be able to see it since it's covered in a giant green tarp. Moving on to the next topic, you might have noticed that I did have to take a small break away from this project in between this episode and the last one. I've been having a lot of fun going around the ruined pizzaplex and recreating it, however it can get to a point where you want to do something different, and that's important to recognize. I've really started to enjoy the command block side of Minecraft much more than just building a single structure, so I wanted to mix things up and keep my brain fresh for whenever I get back into working on this project. And this is something I might keep on doing throughout the series, where I work on multiple parts of Ruin for a few weeks and then go back to making a working gameplay map, just so I don't get tired of doing the same thing for too long. Getting burned out and then not wanting to finish is the last thing I want to happen, so I'm going to continue working on this project with all of this in mind. I mentioned this a lot last year, but if you do things at your own pace, you'll find yourself enjoying what you're doing a whole lot more, while also making sure it's getting done in the way you want. There's still a long way to go before this project is finished, and I want to make sure it's the best I can do. And since there is a lot more of Ruin on the way, I've thought about what more I want to go over during these time lapses, as normally I would just summarize the building process, but now I want to try something different and hear what you might have to say about the project, whether that be overall or a specific part of it. So at least for the next episode, I'll make a community post asking for your questions regarding the Ruin project, or even my thoughts about Ruin overall. I did something similar last year by making a Q&A video at the start of the building series and then one near the end, but I think that going over questions during the build will help you understand what's happening as I'm working on it. As always, I'll be reading the comments on this video, so be sure to let me know what you'd like to see during the build. And with that, the first part of Monty Golf has all been completed, and already a lot of progress has been made. I was honestly debating how I wanted to go about splitting up these time lapses, since most of this build is self-contained to this part of the golf course on the main floor. So I decided it would be best to just split the build up into the two separate floors, where for part 1 we just go ahead and do the entirety of the main golf course, and then once we were done with that we move up to the catwalks and do everything above it. This actually works out quite well for us, as now we've completed all of the parts from chapter 1, meaning we're able to walk around the golf course just like how we can in Ruin. Now eventually we will end up running into some roadblocks like right here where we need to use the Vanny mask to continue, however that will be something we take a look at later on. However, if we go over to the other side of the room, you'll see how empty this area is compared to what we've just gone through, and this is actually like this in Ruin. Even though we can walk around here in the base game, not all of Ruin is accessible to the player, so there was no need for this area to be modeled in Ruin, so I've decided to keep it like this since that's what's shown off in game. Another weird part of Monty Golf that I want to bring up is this wall right here, as it actually changes depending which chapter of Ruin you're playing. So in the base game of Security Breach and in Ruin chapter 1, this 90-degree corner here is in the game. However, if you play in chapter 3 for the catwalk level, this angled wall here actually continues and blocks off this wall completely. And you're probably wondering why the game was designed like this, but if you look closely in Ruin, you'll notice that it's because the Gondola Workshop has a part of it that clips right into the corner of Monty Golf. This level isn't even placed directly on top of Monty Golf, but instead has a part of it that just clips right into the side of the golf course. Now for obvious reasons I don't want to do this for the Minecraft build, so instead what I've done is raise the workshop to be above the ceiling so that way it can fit with the rest of the build. This is once again another really weird design choice I found for the pizzaplex in Ruin, and I can only imagine there's going to be a lot more of this in the future. But now let's move on to the next part we're going to be building, which is actually all of the levels from chapter 3, starting with the gondola ride and then the catwalks, and finally the workshop that leads up to the bakery. Now there's not going to be as much building for this part as there has been for the main golf course, however all of these catwalks are going to be really interesting to work on since they're just hanging in the air above the main floor. So let's get right back into building and see how the finished build turns out. And with that, the entirety of Monty Golf has now been completed, with a total build time of 17 hours and 5 minutes. This puts it ahead of part 1 by around 4 hours, and just behind the daycare by a single hour. But again, I just want to say how happy I am with how all of this has turned out, as this has easily become my new favourite part to build so far. All of the builds just work together in a way that look good, all while keeping the ruined look to everything. Some of this was also pretty difficult to get right, like the gondola ride, which is much smaller than the large room of Monty Golf, so I had to change my way of building to work with this smaller environment, where I tried to prioritize as much detail as I possibly could. This is why you'll see me use some banner patterns like these for the animatronic cardboard cutouts, instead of building them by using different colored blocks. Something else I also did was end up building the completed version of the catwalks, where all of the walkways are connected to each other after we shoot the targets in the AR world. This was mostly just to make the build feel more connected, as now it lets me walk around most of it without needing to fly over to the next part. However, we're not going to be keeping it like this for the final version of the build, so since everything else has now been completed, it's finally time to move on to the second part of the project and make all the changes needed for the AR dimension. And just like how we did this for the daycare, I've once again copied the entire build under the one we've just made, that way we can teleport between the two whenever we use the Vanny mask. And if you want to know how the mask works, then be sure to watch the daycare video as I go over all the commands in that episode. Now, since Monty Golf is a lot taller than the daycare, I had to move all of the AR builds down again so that way the main builds could fit on top of them. Now, there are a few rooms that have changed for the golf course copy, like the gondola ride, which doesn't actually appear here since we're not able to use the Vanny mask during that section. But what the AR world does have is a small room behind the main stage where there's a pile of Monty related items that we can get to during the catwalk level in chapter 3. As you can see in Ruin, most of the build stays the same way, but the main difference between the two is the changing color as well as the addition of some of these glitching textures. So while there's nothing too big to change that we've already made, there's still a lot of smaller details that make up this part of the build. So let's get into one last time lapse and fully complete all of Monty Golf. And now, just after a couple more hours of building, we can now see all of the finished changes made for the AR world, where as we just went over, most of these bigger surfaces have a complete change in color compared to the original build. Some of the leaves on the trees have been replaced with magenta stained glass, and there's a lot of crying obsidian placed all around to show all of the glitching objects that are shown off in Ruin. There's also a few builds that only appear in the AR world, like these floating objects here, but then probably the most obvious one is this glitched out hologram of Monty up on the stage, which is made up of using different types of glass. And if we go ahead and take a look behind it, we can see the way into the extra room that's stored behind here, where we have the different types of Monty related objects piled up in this corner. Now, as one last quick and cool detail to add into the AR world, what I've gone ahead and done is change the biome that this build is into a crimson forest, so that way the game can give off the right type of atmosphere. So now whenever we go to the AR world, there's going to be this pink light that surrounds everything, as well as all of these particle effects that definitely bring a lot more life to the build. For an example of going throughout the two different worlds, we're going to use this staircase right here, where we need to use the Vanny mask to continue forward. So all we need to do is put on this player head, where now we've been teleported to the Monty Golf build under the main one, where now those objects have disappeared and we're able to continue forward. Then when we want to go back to the normal world again, we just go ahead and take the player head off, and now we're able to continue forward while staying in the main version of the build. So now that I've finally added in everything I wanted for Monty Golf, we can now finally call this part of the project completed, and I still can't get over the feeling of walking around the Pizzaplex in a completely different game. Every time I finish a part of the build, I can't help but get excited for the next part, and I really do hope that you'll enjoy the rest of it just as well. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is now going to wrap it up for today's video. I really do hope that you enjoyed it, as it was a lot of fun putting this build together. If you did enjoy it, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe with notifications turned on. That way you know next time I upload, and can also help the channel to continue to grow. But with that being said, thank you everyone so much for watching, and I will of course see you in my next video.